to Insights with me, Lynne O'Donnell. My guest is Shah Mohammad Mehrabi, who's a professor of economics and co-chair of the Afghan Fund, which was set up in September 2022 in Switzerland as a non-profit foundation tasked with protecting and administering around $3.5 billion in Afghanistan's foreign exchange reserves. The previous government, at the time of its collapse in August 2021, had about $9 billion in overseas, mostly US banks, and the Biden administration decided to release half of that amount for the benefit of the Afghan people. Professor Mehrabi, also a former governor of Afghanistan's central bank, has been involved with the fund since its inception and joined me to talk through what's been going on. Have a listen. Professor Mehrabi, how would you describe the economy of Afghanistan almost 3 years after the collapse of the Republic? The UN's development program reported in March that Afghanistan's economy has basically collapsed. Is this how you would characterize it?
I think to be able to assess how the economy is performing now, I think it's important to look at what existed prior to ITA that came into power. I think it's important. A lot of time we neglect to see what type of economy existed prior to ITA that came into power on August 15, 2021. And I think it is important to keep in mind that the fact that economy that is before ITA came, was entering a free fall. I was there at the central bank, and in an economy that existed during prior administration is what economists called a two-tier economy. It was a two-tier economy, and it was, I always say that economy was on a steroid. And that steroid injection that is given to economy, it will keep it moving, but once you cut the steroid off, the economy could easily collapse. So Afghanistan was also what economists always call it was a rentier state. Now, in that rentier state, meaning that the economy's state, the state's spending was reliant on unearned income. That is unearned income, or what economists call rent. So it relied heavily on imports, also what a very important factor to keep in mind. That still is intact as well, that is reliant on import. And then also, when you look at it clearly during this particular period of time, that dependence on unearned income really started back in 2004. And as you know, most of the statistics clearly shows that 75% to 80% of government expenditures were funded by the civilian area, was funded by foreign income, and about 90% if you include the civilian and also the military area expenditure. So clearly, when you look at it, the Afghanistan economy at that time, as economists have clearly looking at the data, is so the Afghani was overvalued during this period of time. Imports were cheap, exports were more expensive. This data shows that wages were distorted. I always argued at that time that indeed this could not be sustained, and the wages did not really reflect the productivity. And that is very important. You cannot go ahead and have an increase in wages without really assessing the productivity of the workers. Domestic production was at the state of decline. And then, as I said, import-oriented economy, reliance heavily was on imports. So you had great aid dependency. Aid flowed continuously, and as long as aid flowed, the economy was doing very well. But then when aid flow decreased from 100% to 42.9% of GDP, then eventually to 20% of GDP, and grants declined and so on, and that created a situation of high unemployment and income to the point where the prior government was not able to go ahead and pay toward the last 6 months, was not able to pay for its employees' salaries. and actually they asked the central bank to rescue them, which central bank was as an independent entity could not go ahead and pay for the fiscal expenses. So that is how the economy existed. Now, August 15 came into being. What happened during August 15? The ITA came into power. And during this particular period of time, there were obviously many economic problems. The first thing that you saw what happened was that foreign aid was cut totally. You had $8 billion per year, which was about 40% of GDP. So that was one thing. Clearly, that was cut off. You had international financial transactions that were totally blocked. Banking system faced substantial liquidity problems. In ADB, the Afghanistan Central Bank foreign exchange reserves were frozen and they were not released. Capital flight was imposed and overall by the central bank, because during prior administration, you had about 6 to 8 billion per year. There was really an alarming rate that capital flight continued during prior administrations. Then exports were limited, and then a few options were available to pay for imports. So as a result of all of that, what happened? Inflation went up. And I predicted that back in 2021. I said the inflation is going to go up. Inflation increased to double digit, and trade deficit also went up. So as a result of that, where you see the GDP declined sharply, and it contracted, and then the estimates are anywhere between 20 to 21% in 2021, and then an additional decline of 3.6% in 2022. Then inflation skyrocketed to about 52%, and economy was really considered by many at a free fall. So that is what happened during the 2001. Now, there's these particular...
2021.
2021. Now, and these challenges obviously had to be met. I had argued at that time that the economy could, if reserves are not released, the argument that I made, this inflation is going to continue, and it will exacerbate the situation to the point where many ordinary people will not have the ability to pay for the basic necessities of life. So, and that clearly was a situation in 2021. So the economy actually improved somewhat in 2022. And part of that reason for improvement was that a massive inflow of aid in the form of cash that helped, as well as remittances to a great extent, helped quite a bit. And that reversed the situation to some extent. And the Afghani became more stable against foreign currencies. And there were many factors, obviously, that I mentioned, some that really contributed to the stabilization of the national currency.
But maybe we can get to that. But this assessment from the UNDP that the Afghan economy has basically collapsed, they were the words of a senior regional official, was made in March. So now there's still no jobs. Women are largely banned from the workplace as well as education. Crops have failed. Natural disasters like earthquakes and floods have been devastating some areas. There's no controlling that. But the Taliban has exacerbated joblessness by banning poppy growing, which did absorb a lot of employment in the rural areas. And the alternative, methamphetamine, will not do that. Mining hasn't developed. So just what is it that the Taliban are doing to revive the economy? And what are the major stumbling blocks to reversing a pretty dire prevailing situation?
Well, I'll come to that in a minute. There are certain facts. Let's look at some of the factual things. Well, I said to you the economy has contracted. That's all the data shows that economy has contracted. The economy has been, as I said, 20 to 26% decline. It depends on which data you look at. The National Statistics Office in Afghanistan says somewhere around that area as well, 20%, 21%. Now, then obviously there is some, I said, as a result of this decline and so on, you've got high degree of unemployment. that exists, and obviously poverty clearly as is there. Inflation has subsided. Initially, as I said to you, inflation was at the rise, but inflation has subsided to a point where now we have deflation in the economy, and deflation is not, I'll talk about the deflation if we need to do, is not as good, is as evil as inflation is for the economy. And the sectors that actually are doing fairly well is agriculture area. Agriculture have seen some recovery. Overall, the trade area has also, to some extent, has not been in a position to really see a revival because of the bottlenecks that have been created somewhat with having no access to corresponding banks, and then the traders not having access fully to their deposits because of the capital limit that has been imposed by the Central Bank of Afghanistan. So you clearly see those particular situations. And if you look at the economy at 2024 now, in 2023 before, there are certain things that I emphasize this because the data shows that, yes, GDP in 2024 had declined. 2025, there's also the GDP might not increase that significantly. GDP per capita has declined because the population is increasing and GDP is decreasing. So you clearly see that as a result of stagnation, that is declining GDP, and no growth that is projected by including the Central Bank of Afghanistan, an increased population, then you will see the GDP per capita will increase. And then also, as I said to you, deflation is in a picture, in bank illiquidity and instability could increase unemployment, and lower level of spending will further result in unemployment situation. Now, you also see clearly here is that some of the achievement, obviously, that has been brought about. I think that is, you've got from the data that I've got from Central Bank, there have been 800 billion Afghanis that have been invested in the mining sector, in transportation sector, in agriculture sector, in the economy. So that's a positive achievement. That achievement by itself means that you are clearly are going to provide opportunities for employment, which is one of the problems that the economy is running into. And also, there has been some of the bottlenecks that existed with regard to licenses that have been, in one way or another, facilitated. The Ministry of Commerce has come up with what was called one-stop shop that existed when I was at the Ministry of Finance as well. That is for the purpose of processing export documentation, and also
cutting red tape,
and better management of licensing, distribution, and so on.
Cutting red tape and facilitating foreign investment, I guess. Mining, I'd be very surprised if mining was developing as a major sector. Tourism is obviously not going to take off. Agriculture seems to be troubled by natural disaster, and as I mentioned, the ban on poppy growing, which did absorb a lot of manpower in the countryside, especially in the south. What, aside from that, and you say that the Taliban are doing a lot to cut the red tape, what are the major stumbling blocks?
I think it's important that has been cited by everyone, that the corruption has been declined significantly, but also,
well, not by everybody, and not definitively, no, but I think that remains to be proven. I think the way corruption is happening might be different, but I don't think it's been eradicated. I think that
I think eradication is that you're looking at now. If you're to compare the corruption rate at the prior administration versus the current one, then you will see that definitely, by looking at the revenue that has been generated, you clearly could argue that indeed the corruption to some extent has been reduced. Is it reduced 100%? We don't have the data, but we can see at the revenue that has been generated, there's been increase in revenue. But I think also there are other areas. There's been, I said, mining sector, there is an investment. Clearly, the large investment has been taking place in the mining sector. That the amount is about 506 million Afghanis. Then also transportation sector, there's investment in that area, about 11.5 billion Afghanis. There's the data also I looked at 117 million Afghanis in the agriculture sector. Trade has got 10 billion. 1.8 billion is in export, and there have been 1,000 products that have been issued licenses. Employment has in these areas have generated so far from the data, look, 646,000 were higher than the last year. So when you look at a CASA, for example, CASA 1000 project will soon start. World Bank is committed to completing that particular project. That will be completed by 2026. And if that is completed by that year, then it is projected that they will be earning about 65 million annually from electricity transit project. That whole project is worth somewhere around, I think, $45 billion. So there's also about 100 factories were established. Over 1,000 production and industrial entities were issued licenses. So those are some of the achievements that actually that one could cite with regard to what is going to happen. Now, the impact of those in concrete terms is what needs to be assessed in years ahead. At this stage, we cannot go ahead. You can speculate as much as we want, but this is what has clearly has been the achievement of with the help of obviously World Bank and the ADB to a great extent. So that has as to what would be the total impact overall, the assessment and of that will have to be done in the years ahead.
Well, Afghanistan does remain an aid-dependent country. Billions of dollars worth of aid and humanitarian assistance has poured into Afghanistan since the republic collapsed, definitely before, as you said, it was a rentier state. Can you break down, at least to some extent, what aid and how much aid has arrived in Afghanistan in the past 3 years?
Well, if you look at, let's look at the 2018 to 2020, total on and off budget of foreign aid. It averaged about 8.4 billion, accounting for approximately 45% of GDP, where I sit here. In 2022, off budget transfer really amounted to 3.7 billion, or about 26% of GDP. So when you look at the total expenditure on public goods and services, both on and off budget, declined by 35% in 2022. Now, that is compared to what existed in 2018 to 2020 average. So the expenditure that is managed by ITA in 2022 was half of the average of the spending during 2018 and 2018 to 2020. So when you look at it, total average expenditures was about 410 billion of Afghanis, 410 Afghanis for 2018 to 2020, and average annual total expenditure in 2022 was 194 billion Afghanis in 2022. That's about 15% of GDP. So when you look at it, that then raising domestic revenue to 410 billion Afghanis, which is about 32% of GDP, in short term is not that feasible. It is not economically feasible. And this means the economic activity will further contract. And then that means in turn, you will also see the continuation of misery that will rise if this particular trend will continue.
Can you break down, as I said, what sort of aid you've been looking at coming in?
Well, there are two areas when you look at it here. You're looking at the aid. One is the aid that comes $40 million per week, the cash flow, but then also the aid with regard to World Bank. World Bank arrears have been were paid off, and so does ADB. So when you look at it, you're looking at the humanitarian aid. That humanitarian aid, what I see here at the stage where I all see the indicator, or that they are going to go ahead and decline. It's from all what I looked at, the data shows that 3.5 to 4 billion annual civilian aid was cut off when ITA came into power. This loss in aid was replaced with humanitarian aid. Humanitarian aid was about 3.8 billion in 2022. In 2023, that aid declined to 1.9 billion, with further decline that is projected for 2024. So the area of that here is the World Bank, International Development Assistance, IDA, in new financing from ERTF can provide some basic needs development, and it could even go into completing some of the projects that World Bank had not completed, trying to bring about sustainable development growth. So
just to clarify, ARTF, the Afghanistan Reconstruction Trust Fund, yeah?
Right. Yes.
Yeah. Well, there's a little confusion. You mentioned the cash delivery. There's a little confusion about that. The United States says that it's provided almost $3 billion in cash alone since August 2021, when the Republic collapsed. And we know it arrives on planes, shrink wrapped on pallets. $40 million. Some reports say $80 million. It would be nice to get some clarification from you on just how much does come in. And it's supposed to cover aid agency costs. And that it's not supposed to go anywhere near the Taliban, which is an unrecognized administration led by people who are sanctioned as terrorists by the United Nations Security Council. But it's also understood that while the money is deposited on paper into the UN agency accounts at the Afghanistan International Bank, the cash is held in the central bank under Taliban control, and it's then transferred to the AIB in smaller amounts, $1 million a day, then converted into Afghanis on the money exchanges. Is that the way it's done? That's the way I understand it to be done. Is that correct?
Well, there's $40 million per week is still transferred to Afghanistan. It is delivered to AIB. My understanding is that once it arrives in Afghanistan, it is transferred in armored vehicles and deposited at AIB. And then the accounts that UN has accounts at the AIB, and they get access to their particular account and disperse it for payment for their employee, as well as for completing their particular project. That is how I see it.
And is that what actually happens? Not what's supposed to happen. Is that what actually happens?
Is that what actually the question to what actually happened? I'm not physically there to be able to inspect as to when it arrives and who go ahead and delivers those particular funds. But based on what my understanding is that once it arrives in Afghanistan, it is transferred directly to international
the AIB.
To Bank for International. No, not BIS. I'm talking about
the Afghanistan International Bank.
AIB. AIB. So it really does. That DAB, it does not go to DAB. DAB does not physically have stored those funds in their vault.
Yeah, there seems to be an awful lot of controversy and confusion around those cash deliveries, and even the amount. We know of 40 million. Sometimes it's represented as 80 million, and there's a lot of people that I know in Kabul who say that a lot of it that is meant to go to the agencies for alleviation of the human suffering that you mentioned earlier, but it doesn't. Where do these reports come from? If you're saying the money goes directly into the AIB, that it's used the way it's supposed to be used, why do we hear that the Taliban takes 50, 60% of it? And how could that happen?
Well, I think, again, it'd be very difficult for me to speculate as to, beside the fact that I just mentioned that the money goes to EIB and United Nations. Obviously, you need to ask that question from United Nations rather than asking me. United Nations will tell you what they have said to me, is that the money goes directly to EIB. We have an account with EIB. We go ahead and disperse the funds for employees' salary and for the project's completion. And that is the question I think you need to ask. United Nations has absolutely rejected, and this is, again, you've probably seen the press, that indeed the money does not go to IT. That's the response, what I've read from the print.
Yep. But yes, indeed, that's what they'll say, and anecdotally and other reporting says otherwise. Can we get on to the Afghan Fund that you're a co-administrator of? It's been somewhat controversial. Could you please explain it and how it's administered and what's been done with it since it was set up in Switzerland almost exactly 2 years ago? I think it was September 2022. What is it? What's your role in it? What happens to the money? Has any of it been dispersed?
Well, since the Afghan Fund was established, but before, I think I need to explain a little bit the history behind how this came about.
Yeah.
Now, foreign exchange reserves are held by the central bank of any country, in this case, Central Bank of Afghanistan, and foreign currencies. And the purpose of those is to primarily to back liability and to influence monetary policy while safeguarding against rapid, what I said, devaluation of the national currency. So these reserves, I think, is very important. They play a critical role in achieving various objectives. And one of the important objectives is the exchange rate stability, instilling confidence in monetary and exchange rate policies, and then also providing liquidity to the banking system and importing covering, import costs. So it's important to keep in mind that these funds are not intended to fulfill humanitarian needs. Yep. And also it's important to keep in mind that these funds belong to Afghan people. So obviously DAB does not have control or access to its reserve because the United States froze $7 billion of reserve held at the Federal Reserve Bank of New York and $2.1 billion that was in Europe and some other countries. In response to this situation, I think President Biden decided to split the reserve into two. 3.5 billion was designated for the benefits of Afghan people, and the other 3.5 was subject to litigation in the United States court.
But could we just explain why it was frozen in the first place? Was because a law in the United States against doing any financial transactions with people or entities designated as terrorists under US law immediately kicked in, didn't it, on August the 15th? We can't do business with you. By law, automatically, these funds are frozen. So it wasn't a personal decision by the Biden administration to freeze the funds. That happened automatically under US law, but it was a personal decision by the US president and administration to unfreeze half of it.
Well, actually, the freezing of our reserve occurred before ITA came into power. So let me tell you exactly the history of that. Prior to ITA that came into power on August 15, we had access. That is, DAB had access to its reserve, and usually the access was facilitated by request that was made by the central bank governor to the Federal Reserve Bank to go ahead and ship certain amount based on the state of the economy to be auctioned off.
Which happened regularly, was monthly?
That was blocked 2 to 3 months prior to auction to take place. So there was an emergency meeting of DAB that was held. In that emergency meeting, a request was made by the Central Supreme Council to the governor, to the president, former president of Afghanistan, to contact Secretary of State Blinken to release those funds, because again there was a strong demand for dollars, and that request was placed by former president, and the release was to take place and then never materialized, and ITA came into power. So what happened here is that I called on President Biden. This is, again, the public record will show that on September 1st to release the funds. And I had the conditions clearly spelled out as to how that could be done, what third-party monitoring, and it should be used exclusively for the purpose of auctioning. If it's not used for that purpose, it should be terminated. So that going back to the 3.5 billion that was earmarked for the Afghan people, it was transferred to BIS system, to Bank for International Settlement for safeguarding. We were told before they established that we needed to establish this fund to insulate the assets from several plaintiffs. What plaintiff claim against Afghanistan that was going on in the court, in the United States court. So the Afghan Fund was established, as you said, 2 years ago, as a response to manage these frozen assets in a manner that will support the Afghan economy. The fund is operating independently. The purpose of the fund is receiving, protecting, preserving, and dispersing assets for the benefit of the Afghan people, including foreign exchange and price stabilization objective. The primary purpose is to be able to stabilize the financial sector. Now, the Afghan Fund has done, a lot of people do not believe that the activities in the accomplishments overall in the achievement that Afghan Fund has done in the last 2 years. The Afghan Fund has established a robust governance structure. Obviously, it has board of directors as one of them, and oversees its operations with a high degree of transparency. It transferred 2.5 billion to BIS to safeguard and protect the fund. It created legal entity. All of these takes time by hiring a Swiss corporate law firm to register the foundation under Swiss law, then deposited this, as I said, into BIS, and then also secured privileges and immunities from the Swiss from the Swiss Federation. Then also adopted an investment strategy. It's very important, I think, here for allocating significant portion of the portfolio in time deposits, and that rolls every 3 months, and it's adding over has accumulated over $300 million. Then also discussed the potential disbursement activities of the assets. We hired an advisory firm to conduct statutory audit in 2024, and then a full audit in 2025. We had an accounting firm to produce quarterly financial statement, hired compliant advisors to work on the compliance policies and procedures, including anti-money laundering and combating the financing of terrorism compliance. So all of these are clearly significant improvement that needs to be highlighted overall. And we had vendor policy also, very important. Obviously, there's so many insurance broker that was hired, communication policy had to be established, created websites, and then we completed International Advisory Committee and hired the executive secretary, and then discussed the disbursement issue for EDB and also EDB and World Bank. Those are some of the accomplishments that the Afghanistan Fund for the Afghan people has done.
So the impression that there are drags on disbursement are misguided. I mean, there's been some suggestion that disbursement hasn't happened because the board members can't agree amongst themselves, and that there is some sort of paralysis because board members have to come to a unanimous consensus on decision making. But from what you're saying, these aren't factors. It's really just the bureaucratic necessities of how to set up something according to very complex and globalized legal requirements. Is that correct?
I expend part-time on these activities. I have expended a lot of time. You remember, this is on pro bono basis. It doesn't come overnight to establish a foundation. Remember, the safeguards are very, very important. We need to be able to clearly, as I said, when we look at a compliance, it is very important. You cannot go ahead and disperse fund unless you have compliance policies and procedures are intact. That will spell out that the money that there is clauses by anti-money laundering and combating financial AML safety compliance totally will have to be done. The same is with vendor policy and procedure, because you have to be able to identify the vendor, verify vendors, and then also look at risk management and what will happen to record, how records will be retained, and then compliance reporting. All of those took a lot of time. As I said, if I spend about half of even though I'm a full-time employee, but then spend at the top of it putting another part-time job to be able to make sure that indeed we safeguard these, preserve them, and then come up with venues to be able, once all these things are completed, then we are going to be able to go ahead and entertain that. As a matter of fact, we discussed the disbursement issue with regard to World Bank and EDB, and for payment of arrears. But ITA paid the arrears that were accumulated in prior administration for the World Bank fully. So that is when that was retired.
There were some early suggestions that the fund could be used to do things like pay Uzbekistan's electricity bills, for instance, but that's not what this money is for, is it?
Exactly. I think that's the reason I spent about 2 to 3 minutes on trying to go over what is the purpose of this particular reserve and so on. I wanted to make sure that people understand that, and the challenges that we are confronted day in and day out with regard to making sure that as one of the trustees, my goal is to be able to make sure that I as one of the trustees, I'm talking for myself, not for the board, is to be able to preserve these funds and to protect them as the statutes tell us, and to be able to look at a possibility of disbursement for sake of bringing about financial stability. Once in the conditions for the Afghanistan Bank are fulfilled, the conditions specifically stating that indeed that AML safety control will have to be totally monitored and evaluated and assessed. The third-party monitoring party will have to be in there, and capacity building will have to be addressed before any disbursement is to take place to the Afghanistan Bank.
And all the trustees like you are working pro bono?
That's correct.
Oh, goodness. There's been some news coverage of Afghanistan's seat at the United Nations and how it's lapsed due to non-payment of the dues, which are $600,000 or $800,000, something like that. What's the process there? Could the UN dues be paid from the Afghan Fund in order to secure the seat?
Well, that issue was, a request was made. The board had already made a decision on that.
Mm-hmm.
And again, going back, that indeed, what I said a minute ago, what is the purpose of this particular fund?
And that does not fall within the parameters of its purposes. Yeah,
I think the response was sent to the parties that made the request, and the board had already ruled on that, and they were informed.
Okay, bringing myself up to date there. Thank you. The currency, if we can talk a little bit about the Afghani, it's remained stable, as you mentioned before. Next door in Pakistan and on the other side of the country in Iran, there is deep and severe economic problems, in part or largely, if you like, caused by US and international sanctions, and of course incompetence and corruption amongst their own leadership, if I may. Can you go into a little bit of detail about why you think or why empirically the Afghani has held its ground?
There are a number of factors, I think, that I'd like to go over. One is the central bank's intervention in the market, and that means that the central bank of Afghanistan adhered to the same policies that they were following during the prior administration. In other words, they were following sound monetary policy, implementation of the sound monetary policy, and intervention in the market through foreign exchange auction has made the national currency relatively stable. While Taliban ITA did not have access to the reserves, but they still had some amount of foreign currency in the vault that allowed them to engage in foreign exchange auction. That is one factor. The second factor that brought about stability is tighter control on transmission and smuggling of foreign currencies to abroad. And I think, as remember at the beginning of our discussion, I talked about how much was smuggled during prior administration. So this was the second factor, I would argue. The third factor, I would argue that the initial stages this year has been reversed. At least the 2022, 2023, there was increase in the volume of exports. So that is another important factor. And I think I've said that to you, another factor, obviously, before I mentioned that, inflow of foreign exchange in the form of humanitarian aid and assistance to the country. That was another factor. And also another additional factor, I would argue, would be measures that were taken by the central bank on the de-dollarization in avoiding the use of foreign currencies in daily transactions by people to the extent possible in most of the provinces. Then also one added factor I would argue is that inflow of workers' remittances from Afghan refugees to the family members. I think these are the factors that have led to the national currency stability and to lower domestic prices, obviously, where they're also has now moved into a deflationary situation in the economy overall, which is not, as I said to you, as evil to the economy as inflation is.
It's still not a good thing, though. I mean, it does indicate deflation does indicate some level of economic instability. How do you deal with that?
Well, as I said to you, deflation, just like inflation, it harms the economy.
Yeah.
If you look at deflation, obviously, and the factors that have led to deflation, I think we need to look at what are the factors that brought about deflation. Obviously, depreciation of Afghani is one. Energy prices, there is better supply and so on of supply and decreased demand. So the way it really hurts the economy is deflation. Is that customers, what do? They say, well, the prices are lower. Let me try to go ahead and delay my buying of goods and services in anticipation that the prices
even lower. Yep, prices.
Which is an economic down. So that when this happens, how do the businesses react? They say, well, people are not buying. Let's try to cut down on production. And cut down production means laying off more people, right? And then further, the economy is going to contract even further. The rate of decline of the economic contraction is going to go even further. So businesses will also have no incentive to really increase investment. As a matter of fact, they would probably reduce investment, and in turn, what that means here, you've got economic growth that will going to go further decline. Ultimately means that you're going to have an increase in poverty, an increase in employment opportunities.
So do you see any definitive impact on the economy of the removal of half the population from the workforce?
Well, you have to be able to look at the long-term economic sustainability issues of what I said to you a minute ago. I think Afghan economy has been benefiting significantly from inflow of donors' fund. Without that, it would have been very difficult in terms of food insecurity as well as starvation. That could have actually resulted in massive number of people who would have been suffering from famine. That has not occurred. I think the country has been like, now we have to be moving. That inflow is not a permanent solution. It is not the solution for bringing economic development. That is why I think the EDB projects and World Bank projects that has been started overall is going to be in a way to look at long-term solution for Afghanistan, and then to concentrate on the areas that needs to bring about employment for the people and improve their livelihood. Going back again, as I said, agriculture sector is an important area. A better use of water resources is very important. The businesses will have to be able to, increase their production, domestic production, that could result in increase in export, and then also being in a position to go ahead and expand as goods and services, goods that are produced domestically, and somewhat emphasizing import substitution policy that economists advocate in this kind of situation. And I think also the World Bank project, as I see 3.0, is clearly also is an important one. Bank assistance, World Bank assistance, I think under the approach 2.0 that was activated after the payment of arrears is very important. And then I always say rely on domestically produced goods and services. It's very important. Move toward as much as possible towards self-sufficiency. I think it's important. And then a very important part from financial sector part is concentrate on banking transaction, allowing corresponding banks to be able to interact with both with private banks, and then after the conditions that are stipulated, to be able to make certain that DAB adheres to, then allow correspondent banking as well. And then IFC obviously is, I think, going to be in one way or another helping, trying to finance some of the private sector area. In the private sector could play a very important role in this particular area as well. Then at the top of it, the Afghanistan Bank could actually follow expansionary monetary policy. I think it's very important in this case, an exchange rate stability. And when I see here in that that follow expansionary monetary policy, I'm talking about circulating more Afghanis into circulation, increasing money supply, you see. And then also trade is very important. I think regional countries to be able to play an important role to encourage trade overall. Trade is going to benefit significantly. As a matter of fact, I'm going back to the time when Adam Smith talked about trade when he was against mercantilist school, and saying that, listen, it is not the amount of gold that you have that really affects the economy. It is in the amount of wealth that is generated is by having more people engage in trade, and more people engaging in having a human skill that will be able to go ahead and come up with new ways of doing things, and so on. So trade clearly will play a very important role in this area as well. So those are some areas that I think that what I see here is that the investment, whether it's bilateral or whether it's multilateral, would play a very important role. Private sector play a very important role. Regional investment and mining, as I talked about before, mining and natural resources, I think are very important. Chinese companies are investing quite a bit in this area, and then extracting valuable minerals like copper, lithium, and what else? Other rare elements. Afghan diasporas could play a very important role in this area as well. I think here is that by making sure that we have small businesses or local businesses are created in this area, I think all of these, as they come into being, will have a significant impact on the investment overall. When you look at what I said to EDB and World Bank in terms of infrastructure development, investment in this area, obviously, whether it's road or bridges or completing of the other project, airport and so on, they all have positive impact on trade and positive connectivity that it brings about for trade. An improvement in this area obviously mean goods and services are going to be expedited for transportation purposes, and it will increase local economies, boost the growth in the economy. It will create jobs, and it will create growth in certain areas. Area that I mentioned, in this case, agriculture and mining sector, I think are very critical in this area. So when you look at all those areas where you see, I didn't talk about a lot about the health and education sector that are very important as well, obviously. Then humanitarian relief also will continue, but I said that would be something that is going to be declining significantly, and I think that's why self-sufficiency is very important in moving out of this area. That there are challenges that this economy is going to face. There's no doubt in anybody's mind that there's limitations, there are challenges. That this particular IT will have to address. We're talking about also security concerns to some extent that could impede investment overall, and that will have to be. You have to be able to go ahead and convince those people that indeed their investments are secure. Then also, I think diversification, I always argue, is a very important factor. I talked about agriculture and mining, but I think limited diversification is very important as well. That other areas that has not been looked at, that need to be explored for development purposes. Now, I think in the regional area, I look at China and India and Pakistan, and they invest their at least China has increased its influence. It has obviously had quite a bit of access to resources there. So the future obviously means that you have to be able to look at all these areas, uh, including governance, strengthen that particular governance area is very important. Then cooperation. I think regional cooperation is very important with neighboring countries because that's where you can new investment opportunities. And I think that is coming into being somewhat.
Well, I was going to ask you whether or not you're an optimist, but it sounds like you do have some optimism about the direction. I guess the doubling of the amount of money that people can take out of their bank accounts on a regular basis will put more cash into the economy. More money circulating is going to be good for some level of growth. I would worry that women are not allowed to work and that women-owned businesses in other similar comparable economies are hugely important to economic activity and growth, and that's not happening. Do you see any change there? It seems to be ideological, certainly not based on any desire for practicalities that women are just completely cut out of and shut off from economic activity and education, especially. Without that changing, can you really be optimistic about the future of the Afghan economy?
Well, I think it's important to keep in mind that health and education are very important factors. Whether you're looking at the impact, if you look at the impact of investment, the areas that I mentioned before, beside those areas, health and education is an investment in this area are very critical. And mostly they are driven by international organization. I think World Bank is clearly very active in this particular area, so is ADB. They have improved access to certain area, but definitely in the area of education, the bottlenecks that has been created clearly crippling the economy overall. In the programs that in health area, obviously you've got vaccination and polio and vaccination and all that is going on somewhat, and there's some degree of involvement in the health sector by other female group, but definitely the education sector and any initiative in that particular area is one of the stumbling blocks that needs to be resolved for the economy to be able to be beneficiary of the 50% of the population or over 50% of the population who do not have access to work or education. To advance their education, higher education, or even
secondary
high school and secondary education. So,
yeah.
So job, I think job creation in those particular area will benefit significantly toward bringing about an increase in growth and activity of the economy.
Yeah, indeed. Well, you haven't been without controversy yourself, Professor. You've been accused of representing the Taliban regime as an administrator of the Afghanistan Trust Fund and of helping the Taliban to access money held in the fund. Your name was raised in a House Foreign Affairs Subcommittee meeting in January. The US administration's special representative to Afghanistan, Thomas West, was asked if you had falsified details of your education and employment. I don't think that you've been given the right of reply. Did you falsify your qualifications? Do you represent the Taliban on the Afghanistan Trust Fund and help the regime help themselves to the money in it?
No.
And are you related by marriage or in any other way to Tom West?
No.
All right. Well, I'm glad we sorted that out too. Thank you so much for your time, Professor. I'm very, very happy to talk with you again. And I hope that things do improve and that the 50% of the population that is needed to get things moving are allowed to do so in the near future, and that the next time you and I talk, there will be real progress to report.
Sure. Good talking to you. Thanks for the invitation. As always.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
And you too, Professor. Bye-bye. Thank you.
That was Professor Shah Mehrabi, a co-chair of the Afghan Fund. He talked about the state of the economy before and after the collapse of the Republic 3 years ago. He presented data on inflows, inflation, deflation and corruption since the Taliban regime came to power, and made note that the exclusion of women from all economic activity is seriously detrimental to economic growth. I hope you enjoyed our conversation. That's all for now. I'm Lynne O'Donnell. Bye-bye.